On the morning of August 10th, 1985, the Soviet nuclear submarine K-431 was not preparing for war. It was docked, silent, motionless. The submarine was tied to a pier at Chazma Bay, near Vladivostok, far from the open ocean, far from enemy forces, far from any scenario that involved danger. The crew was not at battle stations. No alarms were active. No one expected anything extraordinary to happen that day. This was supposed to be routine maintenance. Inside the submarine, technicians were performing a standard operation, refueling the nuclear reactor. It was a procedure conducted dozens of times across the Soviet Navy. Complex, yes, but familiar, regulated, controlled, at least on paper. Above the reactor compartment, a floating crane had been positioned to lift the reactor lid. The process required precision measured in millimeters. Any deviation could disrupt the delicate balance inside the reactor core. That balance was everything. As the crane began its slow movement, no one heard an alarm. No sirens sounded. No emergency protocols were triggered. Observers watched calmly. Officers stood nearby. The operation proceeded exactly as planned, until it didn't. A sudden, almost imperceptible misalignment occurred. The reactor lid was lifted slightly higher than allowed. Not dramatically, not violently, just enough. In a nuclear reactor, just enough is fatal. In that moment, the control rods inside the core were displaced. The chain reaction accelerated uncontrollably. There was no time for correction, no warning window, no second chance. What followed was not a nuclear explosion, but something far worse for those nearby. A thermal explosion ripped through the reactor compartment. The force blasted the reactor lid into the air, tearing through steel and concrete. Radiation surged outward instantly. Superheated steam and radioactive debris erupted from the submarine, rising above the bay in a column that could be seen for kilometers. Men standing on the deck were exposed in seconds. Some were killed instantly. Others were irradiated so severely that survival was never possible, even though they were still alive. And beneath all of this, inside the submarine itself, another killer was already present. Invisible, silent, slow, mercury. The explosion marked the beginning of the disaster. But for many aboard K-431, death had already been waiting long before the reactor failed. The reactor aboard K-431 was not experimental. It was not unfinished. It was not unique. It was a standard Soviet naval nuclear reactor. Compact, powerful, and unforgiving. Unlike civilian reactors built with multiple layers of redundancy and wide safety margins, submarine reactors were designed under different priorities. Space was limited, weight mattered, power density was pushed to extremes. Everything was optimized for performance, not tolerance. The reactor core was small. The energy output was enormous. The margin for error was microscopic. At the heart of the reactor were fuel assemblies and control rods. The control rods absorbed neutrons and regulated the nuclear chain reaction. Their position determined everything: stability, power level, safety. During refueling, the reactor was supposed to be in a deeply subcritical state. Control rods fully inserted. No chance of spontaneous reaction. That assumption depended on one condition. The reactor lid could not be lifted beyond a strictly defined limit. The limit was measured in centimeters. Exceed it, and the geometry of the core changed. Control rods could shift. Neutron absorption would drop. The reaction could accelerate faster than any human response. This was not a theoretical risk. The danger was known. The procedures described it clearly. The instructions were explicit, but the margin was so narrow that even a technically correct operation could drift into catastrophe. On that morning, the floating crane lifting the reactor lid was affected by an external factor, a passing torpedo boat. Its movement created a wake. The water shifted, the crane moved. The reactor lid rose higher than allowed. Not by much, by enough. In nuclear physics, small changes do not stay small. The moment the lid exceeded its safe position, the reactor core crossed a threshold. Control rods were displaced just enough to allow the chain reaction to surge. Power output spiked almost instantly. There was no warning signal designed for this scenario, no automated shutdown fast enough to intervene. No human could react in time. The reactor went prompt critical. In less than a second, the temperature inside the core skyrocketed. Water flashed into steam. Pressure built faster than the structure could contain it. The result was a thermal explosion, not nuclear, but devastating. The blast tore the reactor lid free and hurled it into the air. Radioactive material was ejected directly into the environment. Steam, fuel fragments, and irradiated debris burst outward, bathing the deck and nearby personnel. This was not a failure of combat readiness, not sabotage, not enemy action. It was the consequence of a design that allowed no deviation. The reactor did exactly what physics dictated. It forgave nothing, and it punished instantly. The explosion lasted less than a second. For the men closest to the reactor compartment, that second was final. Those standing directly above the reactor were exposed to an extreme burst of radiation and superheated steam. Some were killed instantly, not by impact, but by energy. Their bodies absorbed lethal doses before pain or awareness could register. Others were still standing. They did not realize what had happened. There was no fireball in the cinematic sense, no rolling shockwave across the base. What followed the explosion was silence, broken only by the sound of falling debris and the hiss of escaping steam. Radiation is not visible. It does not announce itself. Men who had been on deck moments earlier began to feel symptoms within seconds. A metallic taste appeared in their mouths. Dizziness followed. Some experienced sudden nausea. Others felt an intense heat under the skin, despite the cool air of the bay. These were not delayed effects. They were immediate indicators of massive exposure. Inside the submarine, conditions were worse. The reactor compartment had been breached. Radiation levels inside spiked beyond measurement limits. Anyone still inside was effectively trapped in a lethal environment. Protective gear was minimal. Emergency response protocols were not designed for an accident of this scale during maintenance. There was no evacuation plan for a reactor explosion at dock. Men moved instinctively. Some tried to help wounded colleagues. Others attempted to reach exits, unaware that every second spent nearby increased the damage already occurring inside their bodies. Those who survived the first moments would later describe confusion rather than fear. No alarms guided them. No clear orders followed. Command structures collapsed under uncertainty. Radiation spread across the immediate area of the bay. Contaminated steam drifted outward. Personnel on nearby ships and onshore facilities were exposed without understanding the risk. The danger was underestimated almost immediately. Initial reports described an industrial accident. Radiation measurements were delayed. Protective zones were not established fast enough. Many responders entered the area without proper shielding. By the time the severity became clear, exposure had already occurred. For some, survival was still possible, but only in a medical sense. Their lives would be measured in days, weeks, or months, marked by organ failure, immune collapse, and progressive deterioration. The explosion had ended. The disaster had not. And beneath the radiation, Another threat remained embedded in the submarine's systems, one that would not kill instantly, but would linger long after the bay was declared safe. The radiation was immediate. Mercury was not. Long before the reactor failed, K431 already carried another hazard inside its hull, one that had nothing to do with nuclear physics and everything to do with engineering tradition. Mercury was everywhere. In Soviet nuclear submarines, liquid mercury was widely used in precision instruments. Gyroscopes, navigation systems, stabilizers, and sensors relied on it for accuracy. Mercury was dense, reliable, and resistant to vibration, ideal for life beneath the sea. It was also extremely toxic. Inside a submarine, mercury was contained in sealed systems. Under normal conditions, it posed little immediate danger. But normal conditions assumed intact equipment, controlled temperatures, and no structural damage. The explosion changed all of that. Shock waves traveled through the submarine's compartments. Equipment shifted, casings cracked. Some mercury containers ruptured outright. Others developed leaks too small to notice at first. Liquid mercury spilled into bilges and floor channels. More dangerously, it began to evaporate. Mercury vapor is invisible, odorless, easy to inhale. In a closed environment like a submarine, ventilation systems can spread it efficiently from one compartment to another. Even small amounts become dangerous over time. The crew did not know this was happening. Radiation was the focus. It was measurable. It was dramatic. It demanded immediate attention. Mercury poisoning did not announce itself with alarms or instruments. It worked slowly. Men who had already been exposed to radiation began experiencing additional symptoms days and weeks later. Tremors in the hands, difficulty concentrating, sudden mood changes, memory problems, insomnia. These effects were not immediately linked to mercury. They were attributed to stress, to radiation sickness, to psychological trauma. In reality, the crew was being poisoned a second time. Medical personnel were not prepared to diagnose combined exposure, acute radiation injury layered with chronic heavy metal toxicity. Treatment protocols addressed one threat while ignoring the other. By the time mercury contamination was fully acknowledged, exposure had already occurred. Decontamination of the submarine was complex and incomplete. Mercury adhered to surfaces, seeped into cracks, and resisted removal. Some areas were effectively impossible to clean without dismantling entire sections of the vessel. K431 was no longer just radioactive. It was chemically toxic. For the men who had served aboard her, the danger did not end when they left the dock or the hospital. Mercury remained in their bodies, accumulating silently, long after public attention shifted away. The submarine had survived the explosion. The crew would not escape its consequences so easily. Some men left the dock on their own feet. They were not listed among the dead. They were not carried away on stretchers. They appeared to have survived. In the days after the explosion, these men were discharged from immediate care and sent home or reassigned. Their radiation doses were considered non-lethal. Their injuries, if present, were classified as moderate. Officially, they were lucky. Their bodies disagreed. Within weeks, symptoms began to surface. Fatigue that did not pass. Tremors that worsened with time. Difficulty focusing on simple tasks. Sudden mood swings. Irritability, depression, emotional instability. Some could no longer sleep. Others could no longer remember. Doctors struggled to categorize what they were seeing. Radiation sickness had a known progression, but these cases did not follow it cleanly. The symptoms overlapped, blurred, and evolved in unexpected ways. The missing variable was mercury. Heavy metal poisoning does not behave like an acute injury. It accumulates. It embeds itself in tissue. It damages the nervous system slowly and persistently. Combined with radiation exposure, its effects are harder to isolate and easier to dismiss. Many veterans were told their symptoms were psychosomatic. Others were diagnosed with stress-related disorders. Some were advised to rest. Time did not help. Careers ended quietly. Men who had served aboard nuclear submarines, an elite group within the Navy, found themselves unable to perform basic duties. Fine motor skills degraded. Cognitive function declined. Emotional control eroded. Families noticed changes before institutions did. Wives described men who were no longer the same. Children grew up watching fathers struggle with anger, confusion, or withdrawal. These were not visible wounds. There were no bandages, no scars that could be pointed to. There was only decline. Medical records remained fragmented. Diagnoses varied. Connections between radiation exposure, mercury poisoning, and long-term neurological damage were rarely acknowledged in official documentation. Recognition came slowly, if at all. Some survivors lived for decades with chronic conditions. Others died prematurely from complications that were never formally linked to the accident. Their stories were individual, unconnected, easy to overlook. They had walked away from the submarine, but the submarine had not let them go. In the aftermath of the accident, the Soviet Navy moved quickly to define what had happened, and just as quickly to limit how far that definition would go. Officially, the incident aboard K-431 was classified as a non-nuclear accident. There had been no nuclear detonation, no reactor meltdown, no large-scale contamination beyond the immediate area. This framing mattered. By defining the event narrowly, responsibility could be contained. The explosion was described as a technical failure during maintenance, caused by procedural violations. The narrative focused on the moment of the blast, not on the systems that made it possible. Investigations were conducted behind closed doors. Committees examined crane operations, refueling procedures, and adherence to regulations. Reports were written in technical language, dense with diagrams and measurements. Fault was distributed carefully, enough to explain the accident, not enough to expose deeper flaws. Some officers were disciplined, some careers stalled. No one faced public accountability. The role of design was minimized. The extreme sensitivity of the reactor was treated as a known risk, not a defect. The fact that a passing vessel could trigger a catastrophic chain reaction was acknowledged internally, then quietly absorbed into revised procedures. Mercury was barely mentioned. Chemical contamination did not fit neatly into the official story. It complicated medical records. It raised questions about long-term exposure, crew safety, and submarine design choices that extended far beyond a single incident. Addressing it would have meant admitting that K-431 was dangerous even before the explosion, so it remained secondary. Medical documentation reflected this silence. Radiation doses were recorded, acute injuries were treated. Chronic neurological symptoms were logged inconsistently, often without reference to their possible cause. Veterans seeking recognition faced fragmented systems. Some received limited compensation. Others were denied, told there was insufficient evidence linking their condition to service aboard the submarine. The accident faded from public discussion. It was not erased, but it was contained, kept within professional circles, naval reports, and the memories of those directly affected. There were no public trials, no televised hearings, no national reckoning. The submarine itself was eventually decommissioned. K-431 did not return to service. Its hull remained, a contaminated object requiring careful handling. But its story was never fully told alongside its physical fate. What was admitted was enough to close the case. What was not admitted lingered, in bodies, in records, and in the quiet understanding among those who had been there. The system moved on. Those who lived with the consequences did not have that option.